And so at 8:29, Srini, I will allow you the honors of introducing our first speaker.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Bertrand. It was a wonderful session to start with. So Amos Scully is an associate professor teaching industrial design at Rochester Institute of Technology in the US. He's an artist, designer, and educator working in dimensional form, materials, and surfaces through making-based processes. A fitting session for our opening, Amos will discuss design history and how it needs to put forward a more complex version that honors women, diversity, and gender. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you, Amos. Good to see you. So the stage is all yours for the next half an hour.
Wonderful. I hope you can all hear me.
We can hear. I'll be listening in. So.
Great. Great. And I love my background that you all give me, and I'm seeing it now is in flip. So I guess it's a diverse background that maybe I have. Well, this is wonderful. I really appreciate all of what you're doing. And just want to say again that I'm Amos Scully, and I'm honored to be here as part of the WDO initiative and to present to you a topic of icons can't be our only history. And so what I'm putting forward is that design history needs to be more complex version that honors women, diversity, and gender beyond white men and iconic objects. And I also want to say before I start is to a special thanks to Natalie and Sarah for all their work to make this happen. They've been very kind and been really sweet through the whole thing. So thank you for them for all the behind the scenes work. So I guess I'm going to go ahead and just start my topic. I know we have maybe a few minutes extra, but I'm going to go ahead and start it unless there's any reason that I shouldn't.
No objections. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Okay, so on our topic of icons can't be our only history, I wanted to think about history as an important role of who we identify ourselves as. But before I start to talk about that, I want to say that, you know, when I look around at the world of design in various different aspects of things like the Cooper Hewitt Design Museum, I'm so heartened by the fact that diversity has come on so strong, and everyone has taken up the mantle of diversity being what we are and what we do. And you know, the Cooper Hewitt is showing that right here with who the young designers that they reporting are the next generation of that, showing the women, showing the people of color, and also seeing that in higher education through things like the Harvard School, that they're also sort of really making a hard push, at least in how they're making a face of the hard push to what these people are that are going to be part of our future. So it's just always so great to see when I look out that everyone's taking this up as what the next move in design is going to be. But as we look around, and I want to sort of talk about the aspect of people that are talking today is that the remarkable people have also looked at this as what they experience. And so when the Josiah went out to look at what he experienced in going to Milan, he was kind of taken aback by, after experiencing it, that how few Black designers are represented. And so in his lecture at Princeton, he sort of took a survey and went through and found how many Black designers were there in the major furniture brands. And what he came up with was a pretty disappointing statistic that very, very few Black designers are represented in our major furniture brands. And, you know, to his credit, he said that this was just his initial take on it, and that there are certainly designers who are, you know, working for different brands at the same time, so that there may be some gaps in this, but it certainly is stark when you look at it. And then Stephen Burks, also, who is probably one of the leading African-American representatives in the world of furniture, and is such a gifted individual and talks so profoundly about his work. But he's, when asked about, some of what he faces as an African-American, he talks about how, briefly he'll mention, and not surprisingly, that there are still aspects of what he does that people compare him to other African Americans that are in completely different fields, and mention those as who he might be in kinship with. So these things still keep going, and I think we need to make a hard push to make the changes. And I'm glad to see that there are hard pushes being made. But this is not surprising, as we've seen this in the past. And when you go back and look 50 years ago, we see things like that the Lois Nath design department would talk about, or the firm would talk about, their practice of hiring Blacks was that they just skirted the issue by saying we hired talent, and not to really recognize that they have an issue. And so this is not a new scenario, but it certainly is disappointing in how little it's changed. So my question is as I go through this, and as an educator, I think about, how do we change the narrative of who designers are? And as an educator, I have to think about, when I have students walking into the classroom, I have to think about the aspect of history that we're presenting. So while we're presenting today, we also are holding up on the mantle great works of the past. So we know that there are magnificent works that we revere and I revere, and that is going to be a crowded room of white men, and a lot of dashing white men in beautiful suits, and who created magnificent works that I adore what they have done. But it still is a room of crowded white men. And I think that we need to push into that and amend some of the history to include other voices and include some of the diversity that, whatever we can, was there. So we need to amplify the diversity of who designers were. And that takes effort in, and may not always be possible, but where it is possible, I think it's important to change the canon of what the history has been said. So I went ahead and, not being a historian myself, I went ahead and decided I'd pull off the shelf Thaden's tome of 3, beautiful books that look at the icons of history, and these classics that we revere ourselves with. And so, looking at these, I decided that I have to understand a little bit about what I think it to be truths. So I went through this, and I looked at the fact that there's an array of icons that I think range from ones that we've seen before, such as furniture that we're familiar with, to housewares that we might be familiar with too, pop culture things like sticks of gum, and then mega yachts that we might not have ever set foot on. So there's a range of things in here that the icons are, and this is just a quick sampling of some of the things you'll see as you leaf through the book. But I wanted to know a little bit more about who are the designers if we took and looked at those. So I went through the index and charted out who all the designers were by men, women, and by the teams that were listed. And so when I looked at that, I found that it was disappointing that 0.05% were noted as female architects, females who were designers, but but really a scant few names came up, even in something that was as recent as 2006. So, and just as a side note, if any of you are looking to find yourselves in that company, I suggest you look for a last name with the letter of B, because B fared the best with a chance of 9 out of 40. And for those of you who have the last letter of M, I think you're going to have to work pretty hard, because M had 0 females out of 88. But of course, there's lots of design teams that are represented. And so there's a lot that I don't know as I look at some of these things. But the female designers to the male designers were pretty stark. And the teams, I think, are a bit ambiguous as to how many were represented in there. And this, of course, is only me looking for males and females. I don't know, a lot about these things in terms of ethnic backgrounds or race that's represented as well, too. So underrepresented people remains a question in my my quick look, and of course, people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans are also hard to pin down, especially in bygone eras that really had those were largely suppressed. But what I'm trying to suggest here as we look past the icons is to amplify the remarkable people. And as designers, we're good, and we like to recognize people. We like to tell stories, and we know that there's value in telling stories. And so I think that we really need to work on amplifying the history in terms of setting the record a little bit straighter. And for me as an educator, to tell students that there were females who were mavericks in the past. So one of the ones that I think many of us are familiar with is Eileen Gray, who has numerous icons, and she's one of the few females that does appear in this. But Eileen Gray is someone that many of us don't know, and I didn't know that she's someone who was bisexual and mixed with some remarkable lesbians of the era, French singers, American artists, and her lover at one time was the writer Natalie Barney. So Gray was huge, of course, in the design field, and looked on as someone who was definitely making revolutionary new theories in design. And we can recognize some of the icons that that she's done as things that are still produced today. And we can revere some of these things as they are great works. But it's interesting to note that, some of these things that were coming out as her bent tube furniture in 1925, shortly after she launched her own gallery, was something that she was sitting side by side with her work next to Mies van der Rohe and Le Corbusier as a woman. And you can imagine her being that woman in the crowded room of white men and remarkably holding her own. And so things like her works where she created her magnificent housing pieces were largely regarded as someone else's work. And her lover, Jean Badovici, was largely credited with this work and was not given credit to her. And also Le Corbusier received some of the credit to this work. And so it wasn't until years later that some of these magnificent structures that Le Corbusier revered was revealed that it was actually her work, and that in the E1047 was not credited to her in due account as much as it should have been. And so she spent years of acceptance of self-taught women and the male-dominated professions of architecture and design, as the New York Times says. Before, in 1967, when Domus article by Joseph Reichwert actually published who she was and what she was doing. Another Le Corbusier affiliate was Charlotte Perriand, and her work was in his office largely and worked remarkably with him, and other words, side by side, and was someone that I think some of you may know, that the iconic chaise lounge of Le Corbusier has now come to be credited with her, and that complicates our history, and that we need to sort of amend the history to see that this is a work of hers, and what other works of hers that came under his name we need to know. Maybe it's fair to just say that she was a collaborator instead of trying to rename those, but even that goes a long way towards telling us that history isn't giving us the full version of what has happened in the past. Collaborations also that happened in the past with her tell a different story than what we're used to. And so when we look at these things, we need to know about those. So another person of that early era, Lily Reich, was someone who worked in the early eras of the Deutsche Werkbund, and was someone that really lives with large as a Le Corbusier era, but really in the company of Mies van der Rohe. And so when we look at her work, we want to think about how much of an influencer was her on Mies van der Rohe. And Mies van der Rohe would say that he wouldn't listen to anyone, but he would definitely listen to her. And so she was a powerful influence in the work, and you come to wonder how much of that influence she played a role. So some of these works are credited with her as a collaborator, which is important to note. And we want to sort of amplify that voice of her being a collaborator. And then we also want to talk about other works that maybe she deserves sole credit for. So this is the work of the Barcelona Lounge, is something that she did as a very profound work that we would largely like to see her being credited with. So we know that she was also someone that was part of Mies's efforts at the Barcelona Pavilion and came in as the art direction under that. And we know that she was someone that was also a great sensibility towards materials. So how much of this was a collaborative work? How much is the materials? I kind of wonder, should we be giving her more credit? We know that she was working with some of the display cases, but we also want to know, and I would love to know, maybe we'll never know, how much of this was actually under her influence with him. So her standpoint of being part of the history in the design work goes back to even pre the Bauhaus, even though she was part of the Bauhaus, with the predecessor of the Bauhaus, the Deutsche Werkbund, and she became one of the directors there. And you can imagine that as a woman standing in the room and being accepted as a director, she had to have a powerful presence and a very powerful voice. But sadly, when many of the Bauhaus names left and moved to America to flee from the Nazis, she remained behind. And so some of these furniture pieces that she created are lost in obscurity, and we kind of have to wonder, would this be an icon had she had the opportunities of men, or had she been able to flee like some of the other men did? Even other works that are in the MoMA collection that show drawings of hers that were lifted out of obscurity, you kind of wonder, would she have gone on to produce many more works if she weren't there? And sadly, she died under that regime. I'm going to jump over to architecture, because a lot of the work that we know that comes through our field comes from architecture in the past. And so Paul R. Williams is one of America's excellent architects that goes largely under-recognized. And so as an African-American, Williams was someone that has a remarkable story to be told about. Being orphaned at 4 years old, he went on to become an architect who produced 2,000 private homes and upwards of 3,000 buildings in his career. I mean, I'm just trying to grapple with the idea that he's producing 60 buildings a year on average, which is just astounding. And so was he part of the modernists? Largely he was. And but I think that some of his greatest works that are talked about are in the Hollywood arena of California, where he did some very extravagant homes for some of the celebrities of Hollywood, and embracing a modernist style and bringing a lot of outdoor spaces, outdoor living areas to that style. And with that, making luxury hotels that also embrace some of that modernist style with elaborate outdoor areas, as well as indoor areas too. But, I think he pushed into that arena uniquely. He was also known for his Spanish colonialism as part of his other forays in taking some of those Southern California styles that were influenced by Mexico too. But I think that as you look at Williams' work, which I'm giving just a quick overview of, one of the things that digs deep as far as being an African-American is that he was not able to even sit next to his clients due to the discomfort of being African-American, and found himself having to master the skill of drawing upside down so that he could be across the table from them and not standing next to them as part of his race difference. And so he triumphed over all these things, despite all of that, and made a huge footprint on the world of architecture. Going on to receiving many accolades, but early on being one of the first the very first African American in the American Institute of Architects. So probably a little bit more obscure, but Charles Harrison was someone that I think is really unique in the prolificness of him. So he was an African American who largely, I think, is seen as someone for this iconic piece of the Viewmaster that he made during his career. But when we look at the level of work that he did, he reports that he did 2,000 to 3,000 pieces in his career, which is just an astounding amount of design work that is happening, and spanning years and decades of work. But I love to see some of these older design drawings, these design sketches that were creating products of the time. And he was largely one who was creating work for the masses. And so some of his designs tend to be more tame in trying to capture that audience. But he spent most of his time working for a couple of manufacturers, but largely he was working for Sears as part of what he did. But many household products that he did that were produced in large numbers. But interesting to see, somebody who was an African-American who was being sent abroad to source materials and develop relationships with the Japanese for the first television to be brought over to the United States. And I'm just trying to imagine him being the only African-American in the room of white men, and then being sent to China to garnish those relationships. What a master he must have been at talking through design. So many works, again, thousands of pieces that I'm just showing you a handful of that dated up until the 1990s. But I think that there's something to be said for maybe he didn't have his mark in the icons of history, but he certainly reached enormous number of people in creating work that was accessible and affordable to the common person through through Sears Roebuck, that is, you know, one of the major manufacturers until recently in the United States. So there's going to be so many people that I wish I had time to talk to. Marilyn Doors, who worked in the automotive industry. Eva Zeisel, who some of you probably know her work in pottery, and another remarkable story, Eva Zeisel, who was, you know, spent time in solitary confinement being a socialist in Russia, and then went back into industry afterwards, and produced work right up until the end. But I do want to catch up a little bit with more recent people. And so when I look at someone like Patty Moore, who is a graduate of our program in its infancy in 1970s, Patty is really one of the great champions of diversity and a renowned gerontologist because of her work in inclusive design and universal design. But Patty was the one, for those of you who aren't familiar with her story, was the one that when she was working in her early career in her 20s, and this is long after from this picture, for Raymond Loewy, she was talking about, you know, the need to include people who are elders, who are aging. And Loewy famously said, "We don't design for those people." And so Patty took it up as a mantle to try to push into that space. And she did in the most remarkable way of spending years dressed as an 80-year-old woman and walking the streets of the United States and Canada. And not just, you know, a few weeks here and there. She did this at, you know, the expense of her own well-being. And famously, she was mugged and beaten up to the point where she never was able to have children because of her injuries based upon this role that she took on to try to understand what it's like to be of that age group. So her work in diversity is huge for moving into universal design and being a pioneer in universal design. And though we can't say something as iconic as the OXO peeler is her name, she was certainly part of the design process that was brought to it with SMART as in creating it. And she went on to help and usher in areas that were hospital rehabilitation centers for people who had undergone difficult circumstances. She wanted to help people where design really was needed. She worked, one of her more famous pieces was the Phoenix Light Rail, trying to understand accessibility of that. And she's worked with trying to understand veterans and their needs and try to advocate for them as far as understanding. And certainly aging in place is something that, as she works as aging in place is something that Patty is very much an advocate for. But her accolades go pretty deep, although as my part of my talk is to say, not really any iconic pieces that will ever sort of make the design classics, although her influence is huge. And then the last person kind of catching up to more recently is African-American Ed Welburn, who, for those of you who are automotive fans, is a huge person in the General Motors, leading him until the up to recent is the vice president of global design and the 6th design leader at General Motors. He overcame so much, I'm sure, as being Black, to the point where he was overseeing 1,800 people in design and development as his career developed. And numerous global footprints for what he was overseeing in design and development at General Motors. He got his early start at General Motors and never looked back and remained there and just continued to work through General Motors, climbing in the design field as it grew too. In the 80s, moving into the line of Oldsmobile, which is now since gone by the wayside, but doing really interesting projects along the way of creating the land speed record for, and this is one of his sketches of the Aerotech a 4-cylinder car that made 290 miles an hour. This is him more recently with the Aerotech. And you can see him, with some of the Chavant clay. Concept cars that he was overseeing as the design departments are just too numerous to list. The Cadillac Seal, the Corvettes was some of his signature pieces that he oversaw, as well as him being part of the design as they started to move into electric cars, such as the electric Chevy Volt. Camaros and Corvettes. I mean, the list is far too long for him to talk about the number of automobiles that he oversaw. So why can't icons be our only history? I think that we need to recognize that the icons of the past, and as they're recorded in the history books, often exclude women. They certainly didn't even allow for Blacks to be entered into them, or were marginalized in the process. We saw, as I mentioned in there, that they don't credit properly some of the collaborators and important team members of those. And we'll never know probably if there's some of the people who are lesbian and gay. I think Eileen Gray was the only one that I could identify in poking into history. Again, I'm not a historian. So what we need to do as designers, we need to amplify the people of our past. As much as we love products and we love designs, we need to hear their stories to really better tell us as who we are, and to, I think, help inspire the younger designers to know that these people did exist and they did make remarkable work despite all odds. So I'm proposing that we need to tell stories of these designers as maverick people moving beyond the iconic forms. I'm proposing that we need to share and appropriate the credit of the icons to the people who were part of it, and not just solely to the white men in the room. I'm suggesting that museums need to identify those collaborators when they start to pull out their collections. And I think that in general, we just need to record the people, thinking about them as the stories that we want to tell, and letting those stories come to light to make our design more vibrant and more inclusive. So that is all.
Thank you very much, Amos. That was wonderful. We will, we invite you actually to stay behind. There was a question that was posted in the Q&A section of Zoom. If you can maybe take a minute and potentially answer this question while we welcome our next moderator.
Thank you, Natalie.
Thank you very much.